Hello, it's your instructor Jacob here again, and today we're going to start on our exploration of economics by asking the question, what is economics? This will be a pretty typical first day lecture. You're going to hear definitions, you're going to hear, a basic explanation of what this field is all about, and then we can start to get into the real meat of it. So let me pull up that PowerPoint. I apologize about the video quality. I know that board it's kind of hard to read it, but I don't think we'll actually be using it that much. So let's get into the PowerPoint. What is economics? Now, let's think for a moment. What comes to your mind when you hear the word economics? Because in all likelihood, you probably don't know much about it if you're in here. Maybe you do, and that'd be great if you are, but I know from experience, most of the students that already know a little bit of economics, they go take 2110, not 2000. Well, when you think about economics, you're probably thinking about things like unemployment, recessions, inflation, business regulations, taxes, international trade, budget deficits. In some sense, when you think of economics, you think of the adult world, right? The world of business, the world of commerce, the world of people making a living. It's all about goods and money and services and the way that these things circulate around. Whoops. And to most people, that's the case. Economics is the study of business, commerce, and trade. It's a social science that studies the economy. And that itself bears a little bit of elaboration. See, it's a social science in the same mold as psychology, sociology, anthropology, and political science. That is, it is a field which uses the scientific method to analyze the behavior of people. At the grade school level, you would have called it social studies. And I'll tell you up front, a lot of people look down on the social sciences. They view them as being unreliable. They view them as being very subject to personal bias. And that's true. The social sciences are very young. We haven't had them for near as long as we've had the natural sciences. And the social sciences are also a lot more chaotic than the natural sciences. You've probably heard or yourself whined before because you looked up the weather report one day and it said it was going to be sunny outside, but then you got rained on anyways. Well, that kind of thing happens a lot in economics. Somebody says we're going to have a boom and then we have a bust instead. They say the stock market's going to go up and then it goes down. Well, economics has a similar issue as meteorology or climatology in that it studies very chaotic systems. They're very chaotic because they're incredibly complex, but they're also very chaotic because we're dealing with people. With physical matter, it's so easy. With physical matter, you can run experiments on it. You can put it in a lab, and then you can study it under controlled conditions. But we can't do that with people. And unlike physical matter, people change. People often surprise us with their behaviors. So our field, it's always going to be just as much philosophy or just as much art as it is real science. But there is science in it. We do statistical analyses, and we look for things called natural experiments, where nature gives us something as close as possible to a laboratory experiment. For the most part, you won't have to worry so much about that in this course. Because this is a beginner survey course, I don't teach you econometrics. I don't teach you hypothesis testing or anything like that. We're not really going to be talking about the nitty-gritty of how economic research is conducted. But it's good to know that we do have the same tool set as people like psychologists. Now, what's meant by the economy? Well, That's one of those things that everyone understands, but it's a little hard to put into words. But the way I like to describe it is that the economy is that set of interlocking systems and the web of interactions people make within those systems that produce, distribute, and consume goods and resources. The economy is the factories and the farms, and it's the roads between them. And the economy is the people that work within those businesses, and the economy is the stores in which those uh, trades take place. Well, the economy really isn't the physical capital. It's not really the physical buildings and machines, but it's the way in which they're used. It's the system in which they work. If society were like a living creature, personally, I believe that it is literally a living creature. I've lectured on it before as a filler thing at the end of the semester. But if society were like a living creature, economics would be like anatomy or medicine, a discipline that asks us, how does this living thing live? How does it keep itself running? How does it bring in resources? How does it consume those resources? How does it move it to where it needs to go? Now, early economists, and we're talking about late 1700s, you're going to get a little more of the historical background later in the course. Early economists called this field political economy, and they treated it as a subfield of political philosophy. Then later on, home economics was created from it to deal with family level planning. Honestly, I don't even know if they teach home ec anymore in schools. They called it personal finance in my day, but if you're familiar with it, things like how to do your taxes, how to manage debt, how to, repair basic things. Essentially, everything you would need to know about how to run your life properly as an individual family. Well, economics, it predates it, but it was the same concept scaled up to an entire society. But in time, economics would grow to be about so much more than just business. Economists have studied all kinds of different phenomena. Some of the ones that I personally have an interest in include religious phenomena. There has been economic research into the choice of what church to go to explain mysteries like why is it that the more hardcore demanding churches actually grow faster than the more easy and lax churches? For example, Pentecostalism is growing much faster than, say, Lutheranism is. And there's been economic research into family planning. Who do you choose to marry? Do online dating sites actually work? And how many kids does a family have? And there's economic research into political life. That's one of my main fields. How do revolutions happen? Revolutions, they often seem so uh, impossible until they happen. You don't see them coming, and yet after they happen, they seem to have been inevitable. Why is that? Well, there's been economic research into that question. See, economics is capable of handling a very wide range of topics that go far beyond just the counting of dollars. So, what economics grew into was a science of choice, and this is our modern understanding of what it is. A science of choice. How do people go about making decisions? And if you have an objective, goals, and you have constraints, limits, you've got an economic problem. Just about anything in this world can be made into an economic problem. Well, what might these objectives and constraints look like? Well, objectives can be things like maximizing profit if you're a businessman, or maximizing satisfaction if you're a consumer. I know that's a little vague, but you go to the store, you have a certain amount of money to spend. How do you want to spend your money, right? That's maximizing satisfaction. But it could be other things too, like maximizing health. Or if you were the manager of a charity, your goal would be to maximize well-being of the community that you serve. And constraints, likewise, can refer to any sort of limitations on your behavior. One of the most common constraints we face as consumers is a budget. We can't spend more than we earn. Or it could be hours in the day. How are you going to allocate your time to all the different tasks that you want to complete? Or we could be talking about raw resources that are available. Or we could be talking about a decision where I have to implement, say, one production technique out of different options. That's a constraint on me. I can't do everything. I have to pick one. Moreover, economics is different from other social sciences in that it assumes people are rational in how they make their decisions. From what I've described so far, you might be thinking, well, this sounds an awful lot like sociology. How is this different from sociology? And honestly, there's not that much of a distinction between the two fields nowadays. But the one thing that economists always do that the other fields don't necessarily is assume that rationality. Now, this also gets a lot of people upset because they don't really understand what we mean by that. So they'll say, "Oh, well, of course people are irrational. People aren't always rational. Are you're telling me that people always make perfect decisions? You're telling me that people only care about money, that they're just selfish? Do you think people don't have emotions?" Well, think about it. Do you think that's what we argue in economics? No, of course not. In economics, what we mean by behaving rationally is that people try to do the best they can to fulfill the goals they have set. People might have faulty or imperfect information, which would cause them to make mistakes sometimes, but we don't assume they're stupid. We believe that they do the best they can to interpret the information they're given. And people may also have different values for the same thing. If one person is willing to pay more for an item than another because they value it more, then that's still rational for the goal of maximizing their own satisfaction. And even things like charity and self sacrifice can be modeled economically. The goal doesn't have to be a selfish one, it doesn't have to be about your personal feelings. We can model things like family planning, which involves a lot of self sacrifice, right? Of the parent for the child. We study things like that all the time. But the big thing is, when someone's behavior seems strange, we as economists want to step back and ask ourselves, is this person wrong? Or do they just know something I don't? Because very often we find that that's the case. See, economists believe that people's behavior is predictable, yet it's often surprising. People respond to incentives, but the world is complex. And these incentives can be used to control human behavior for good ends, but often they have unintended consequences that can cause evil. Often it's not until someone's grand vision is implemented that we realize the perverse incentives it created and thus the great harm it causes. And all throughout this course, you're going to see examples of that. Examples where incentives are used to coordinate people, to get along together, to do the right thing, to live harmoniously, but also cases where the incentives are bad, the incentives are wrong, and they cause people to live in conflict, or they cause people to do the wrong thing to the expense of others and even ultimately to their own expense. And because economics involves constraints, another important concept we have to deal with is scarcity. See, to an economist, scarce does not mean rare. It just means that there are limitations. You cannot have more of something without giving up something else. We all have unlimited wants. Maybe you don't believe that yet, but trust me, if you had $1 million, you'd want $1,000,001. We all have unlimited wants. People are always able to adjust. They're always able to find some other thing that they think that they need, no matter how much they get. Yet we only have limited resources, limited time, and limited options to fulfill these wants. Got a question for you. Of the following three items, or things, which of the following would you say are scarce? Potatoes, diamonds, or vacation time? All of them are scarce. Of course, you probably could tell that was a trick question. The bait is, you try to sucker in an in-person course. We're trying to sucker someone into saying diamonds, right? Diamonds are scarce because diamonds are the most rare. They're the hardest to get. They're the hardest to find out in nature, and because of that, they're also the most expensive. But all of them are scarce because all of them involve a trade-off. If you wanted more potatoes, you'd have to work more hours, either to grow them yourself or to earn the money for them. That would leave less time for vacation. Or you could buy less diamonds to afford the potatoes. But either way, to get the potatoes would require you to give up something else. Similarly, if you decided to take more vacation time, unpaid vacation time, then that would leave you less money with which to buy potatoes or diamonds. It would leave you with less time to go and gather those things yourself, to dig or to, farm. I'm trying to emphasize they're scarce both from the perspective of production and also from the perspective of the consumer. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about you buying them or you making them yourself. All three of these goods involve some kind of sacrifice. Something that if I want more of it, I have to give up something else. And ultimately, time is going to be the main scarce resource. It's not the only one, but most things you'll be able to translate into time. The time it takes you to earn them, to get them. Whether things are common or rare, they are scarce. Scarcity exists everywhere around us, and it's never going away. And because of scarcity, economics is a matter of trade-offs. What will be made? How will it be made? Who will it go to? And most importantly of all, who decides? Because we live in a capitalist society, economics is mostly going to focus on capitalist or free market economies. This is normal. Any course you take, it's going to focus on capitalism. Now, what exactly is capitalism? Well, that's another one of those big words that has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. Whether you hear me refer to capitalism or market economies in this course, what I mean is an economic system, a social system, where people's decision making is voluntary. That is, they get to make a decision at all. You choose what to buy, you choose where to work, you choose what to spend your money on. If you're a producer, you get to choose your own price. You're not guaranteed to get a sale. You might set a price so high nobody wants to buy. But you have the right to make that decision, even if it causes you to fail. Now, nobody lives in a truly free market. All markets have regulations. All markets have limitations on what you can do. But on a sliding scale from more controlled to more free economies, we live in a relatively free one. And so you may also think of this course as being the study of capitalism. However, it's important to study a thing's antithesis to understand it properly, to look at its opposite. If you really want to understand a thing, you also need to understand what it's like when that thing is taken away. And so this course is often going to discuss socialism and communism and Marxism, the non-mainstream social science that studies economics from a socialist perspective. Marxism is a part of economics, but it's not considered legitimate in most universities. I would compare it to like crystal healing. You're not going to go to medical school and hear them talk about crystal healing at medical school. I do discuss it though, because I feel it's valuable to you all to understand these concepts, since there are people who do believe in them and they do have an impact on the world because of that. I don't know that we're going to talk about it that much in the summer course, honestly, because since the summer course is so short and some of my material just wouldn't be fun in a video recording, I had to cut it, but we're going to get into it at least a little bit. Now, this course is also going to be divided into two mega units, microeconomics and macroeconomics, understanding that there's not a perfect split between the two. So micro or small economics is a close-up look. And micro would ask questions like, how would a hurricane affect orange prices? What would happen to output if a company had a monopoly? And how can two competing stores survive and make a profit? Microeconomics is about individual markets, individual firms, individual consumers, individual goods. We're taking just one little strand, just one little piece of that complex web, one system within the web of systems, and we're bearing down on it. Then macro, on the other hand, big, right? Macroeconomics, big economics, is the big picture view. And it would ask questions like, what will happen to GDP if the Federal Reserve inflates the currency? Why are some countries rich and others are poor? And how does economic structure determine the political structure of a nation? Macroeconomics is about the society as a whole. Instead of looking at just one piece of it, we get the whole thing combined together. Often that means that we also aren't including as much detail either. Macroeconomics is going to be much more abstract than microeconomics. And I teach a lot of economic history in this course. Economic history can refer to kind of two different things. Either you're using lessons from history to reveal truths about economics, or you're using economics to understand history. It can go in either direction. In past semesters, this mostly came up in two big units. I had this nice little division where for microeconomics, I had a micro story, a very intimate, I told it like an actual story about our one communist insurgency in America, 1920s West Virginia. And then for macroeconomics, I had a big story about how Europeans created the modern world, both for good and bad. Unfortunately, like I said, I had to cut some material. I don't know that we're going to be doing that communist story, but we're definitely doing the macro one. And you'll also get a lot of little econ history stories throughout the course, usually used to illustrate some point, to give a practical example of how this concept played out in real life. Another thing that we need to discuss, depending on how much you know about economics, you might have heard people whine about our models. They say economics is based too much around models. Oh, their models don't look like reality. Well, yes and no. See, what a model is it's a stylized simplification of reality. We make assumptions about the world or about human nature, behavior, motivation, and then we derive predictions from those assumptions. And the models are always inaccurate because they always leave out some detail. They always leave out some nuance that the real world has. But being stylized means that they can make the big picture clearer. Let's talk about that picture in the upper right corner. I imagine you've heard of caricatures before. Stylized depictions of a person. Do you all know who that is? I'll give you a moment to think on it. It's Richard Nixon, isn't it? It's old Tricky Dick. See, I bet that most of you watching almost immediately guessed who that man was in the caricature. And yet, he doesn't look anything like his real photo, does he? I mean, where's the giant bulbous nose? Where's the jaw extending down to his hands? Where's the squinting eyes where you can't even see the eyes. They're so swollen up. That caricature is an absolutely horrible portrayal of Richard Nixon. And yet, most of you would have gotten it right away. See, the caricature is stylized, it's exaggerated, it's inaccurate, but it captures the essence of a person by focusing on those details of their appearance that make them different from other people. Well, our models are going to act like caricatures of the real economic system. Because they're exaggerated, because they cut out certain real world details, they're going to throw the most salient features of the economy into sharp relief to where we can better understand the economy. Only by cutting out some of the clutter can we make the economy understandable. Because if you left all the detail in at once, you would have a perfect picture, but you'd be unable to understand what you're looking at. Now, at the graduate level, like what the professors do, what we read in our journals, at the graduate level, the models are a field of theoretical mathematics. We give everything a precise mathematical definition expressed in set theory, and then we prove theorems off of it. It's the same as the ancient Greeks inventing geometry. Start out with some axioms, make some definitions, and then you just start working off of those axioms until you've built up an entire incredible system of thought that's capable of doing things you would never believe. I want to tell you too, I know that at least several of you are going to be engineers or math majors. And if you are, I would very much like to share some graduate theory with you. You don't really need the undergraduate economics. It helps, but you don't need it to understand graduate econ. Now, economics majors at the undergraduate level, they mostly use graphical arguments and algebra, maybe a little like calculus. But I understand most of you are not majors, most of you are not STEM majors, and there are no prereqs for this course. And so what I do in this class is I show you graphs, but I prioritize storytelling and examples over statistics and math. Nobody wants to hear me read off a bunch of numbers. Nobody wants to do algebra in here. And so most of the time, I use anecdotes, not because anecdotes are all we have, but because I believe that anecdotes are the best way to reach the general public. And that was the approach of the great economist Thomas Sowell, who wrote your recommended text, Basic Economics. Every now and then, there might be a rare exercise on the homework that does involve a little bit of algebra, but frankly, it's stuff that you ought to be able to do at your age. Then we've got the big ideas. So throughout this class, there are some big ideas we'll be building towards. Your recommended textbook has a set of big ideas. Mine are different from it. I like to emphasize different things. So these are like themes. You're not going to be tested on them, but they're things that I want you to be thinking about. And as you go over the coming weeks, relating what I teach to these themes. How does the course material illustrate them? And how does your understanding of them deepen over time? So, what are the big ideas? Number one, people respond to incentives. People are not unthinking, people are not unresponsive. People are very proactive in how they interact with the world, and they respond to incentives because they all have that quest to fulfill their goals, whatever those goals may be. Number two, building off of that, the richest societies match self interest with the common interest. Because people respond to incentives, it's crucially important that a society develop incentives that reward good behavior. The more a society can do that, the more it's going to prosper. Number three, trade offs are everywhere. And this doesn't just mean in terms of how you use resources, but this also applies a lot to policies. And you've got a whole unit that's going to show you how policies can make some people better off, but only at the expense of making other people worse off. There are no easy answers in life. There's especially no easy answers in political life. And you need, whether in your individual life or potentially as a businessman down the line, or in your political life as a voter or a possible representative, you have to understand that everything comes with a cost. Big idea number four, voluntary trade creates value. It creates value in and of itself. Number five, markets usually maximize efficiency. The capitalist system is, I truly believe, the finest economic system the world has ever seen. It may not be the finest one imaginable, but it's probably close. But it does have flaws. And we're going to discuss those flaws in Unit 2. Number six, cooperation creates more wealth than predation, at least in the long run. A society can get extremely rich off of brutality. A society can get rich off of things like slavery and looting, but it can only stay rich for a short time. Long-term growth depends upon people cooperating. Big idea number seven, incentives drive innovations, which drive growth. Your technological change is also not accidental. Technological change itself is a product of human action. It's a product of research, which is done by people. And so the direction of that technological change is going to depend on how society rewards or punishes innovation, and also the specific types of innovation that it values. Number eight, democracy and capitalism need each other to make humanity thrive. Unit 4 is going to revolve around that. Economic and political systems are intertwined. They both exert some force on each other. They transform each other to look more like each other. There is a reason why every communist country aspired to be democratic and yet wound up as a dictatorship. And finally, big idea number 9, the middle class is the soul of a nation. This goes hand in hand with number 8, but if you don't have a healthy middle class, you're not going to have a healthy democracy, you're not going to have a healthy capitalist society, and your country is going down the tubes. And one last thing. There are 2 terms you may hear come up in this course. Honestly, they're probably not going to come up that much. Still, We try to draw a distinction between what's called positive statements and normative statements. So, positive statements are statements that are meant to describe fact without moral judgments, whereas normative statements are statements that are meant to give moral prescriptions. So, a positive statement is something that's framed as this is how things are, while normative is this is how things ought to be. If you were to warn somebody, oh, if you leave your meat out in the fridge for too long, it's eventually going to spoil. That would be a positive statement. If you were to tell them you should not leave your meat out in the fridge for a week because it's going to spoil, that would be a normative statement. And economics is supposed to be a positive social science, but normative beliefs inevitably color how we interpret things, especially through how we determine things like efficiency, how we define concepts like efficiency. Economics wants to be objective, but in reality, it's not. And this is why I also like to disclose my own political beliefs. See, there's a common belief that instructors ought to be neutral. They ought to be as neutral as possible to the point where you cannot guess what they believe. And I believe that this is a very good ideal when you're talking about grade school, because grade school children, they're very trusting, right? They're too young, they don't have enough knowledge, and they don't have enough wisdom to be able to evaluate things for themselves. They're a blank slate on which their parents and their teachers write. But for adults, it's a different matter. You all are old enough that you can think critically. And I think that being upfront is a heck of a lot more honest. See, what originally got me thinking about this topic was the news. We live in an era of extremely politicized news, and it often upsets people. And they say, oh, we should go back to the good old days when news was more objective, when news was more neutral. And the problem is, those times never really existed. There was always bias. Newsmen were always trying to direct society one way or the other. And understand, I'm talking about both from the left and the right. But earlier in the nation's history, they were actually more openly partisan. You would have a newspaper, and it would be titled something like the Cincinnati Democrat or the Clemson Whig. They would often put their political affiliations front and center. And then, of course, the paper would be like really exaggerated propaganda. But you knew that you were reading propaganda because they told you that you were reading propaganda. And so people could sample the different kinds of propaganda. And from the average of it all, they could kind of get a good sense of reality. And I thought, that's wonderful. That is a much better way for people to discourse with each other. Economics is a social science. And because of that, because it deals with society, it's inherently political. And there are political biases baked into it. Not everyone can be correct, can be equally correct about controversies. And my goal is to be balanced in my approach. I like to think that my lecturing actually is a lot more diverse in the perspectives provided than a lot of econ classes I've had over the years. But in the spirit of that, of what I've said, I do like to share my own views. And so I consider myself more than anything to be a classical liberal, a romantic nationalist, and a populist. Now, what is classical liberalism? That's the ideology of the founding fathers of the American Revolution, of the French Revolution. Its closest equivalents nowadays are libertarianism and conservatism, but it's not exactly the same thing. It tended to advocate for small government, and it tended to advocate, well, it always advocated for republicanism, right? Representative government. And for me, I'm a Jeffersonian Democrat more specifically. Thomas Jefferson is far and away my favorite of the founding fathers. And the Jeffersonian Democrats argued that society is happiest when political power and economic power are dispersed. You want to have a society that is controlled by the middle class and by its local government. It's a capitalist society, but it's not a capitalist society run by and for big business. Now, what about romantic nationalism? Well, it holds that nation states are the best and most natural form of social organization. So, a nation is a self reproducing culture of people, like an extended family. And states are monopolies on the enforcement of law, a government with a gun, right? When you refer to a state, that tends to mean the government as well as all of the people and territory that that government controls. And the Romantics, they believed that the best life was to be had in a society where a nation had its own state. And that was in the spirit of the revolutions. See, at some point, nationalism got tarred and feathered as being collectivist and as being based around bigotry. It happened because of World War II, right? With the fascist experience. But that's not what nationalism began as. In the 1800s, nationalism was about freeing people from foreign tyrants, not conquering them. You had men like Garibaldi running around trying to liberate Italy from foreign control, trying to liberate Latin America. You had the Latin American nationalists. You had the Poles and Hungarians fighting wars for independence. At that time, there was this global elite of nobility that ruled Europe and by extension, most of the world. And their rule extended across borders. It extended across cultural borders. And the nationalists wanted them gone. They went hand in hand with classical liberalism because they believed that the only way you could have a free society was if people were able to make their decisions at the local level. That meant that the nation had to have its own state. Nations had to be independent if they were to also be free. And it only became ugly when nationalism started to be fused with big government ideologies. Whether you're talking about fascism in Europe or oftentimes in the third world, communist movements were nationalist as well. But that's all for now. In the next video, we'll start our discussion of the marginal principle, and we'll work our way towards building up our supply and demand model, which is going to be the core of all of our economics for this course.